Hello, welcome to the Icelandic Roots webinar series. This is a public webinar. Today, we're really lucky to have Hildur Sigurbergsdóttir to talk with us. Hildur was born in Reykjavik. She attended Kvennaskólann, graduating in 2021, got a degree in social studies. Then she got her bachelor's degree at Háskóli Íslands and with a BA in history. And her thesis was on this topic of Indigenous and Icelandic interaction in North America. In 2024, she did the Snorri program, Snorri West, and came to North America. And she now has a job at RÚV and is getting a master's in communication and media at the University of Iceland. I just wanted to share that I got permission from Hildur to show a picture of her at Snorri West. And it's really an amazing picture. If you ever want to do Snorri West, we immediately make you a cowboy. I don't know if you can see that. But maybe I can get a better shot here. I think I shared the wrong one. So there she is with her cowboy hat and her bolo tie in Alberta. And I will attest that she's gained a lot of the cultural aspects of being North American since coming here. So with a big yeehaw, let's take it away, and Hildur can give us her presentation. We'll have a Q&A. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Jason. That is the greatest picture of me ever, I think. Let's see, I'm gonna find my slides here. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Jason, for inviting me. So my name is Hildur, and I'm going to talk about my bachelor's thesis. I wrote it last spring. It has this very interesting title, Bears, Wolves, and Indians, and is about the relationship between Icelandic immigrants in Canada and Indigenous peoples. So there we go. I want to start off by explaining why I chose this topic. So yeah, 2 years ago, I went on Snorri West. If you haven't heard of the Snorri trips, I encourage you to look it up. So we went to Alberta and Saskatchewan. You might be able to tell from the pictures, the cowboy hat was always on. So it was during that trip where I first heard about Indigenous history. I'm almost like a little bit ashamed to admit that I hadn't really heard of Indigenous history before, but through that trip, when we heard stories of truth and reconciliation and hearing land acknowledgement, it really made me wonder, like, oh, what is this, and why haven't I heard of it? So in the fall of 2024, I did a semester at the University of Ottawa, where I took a course on Indigenous history, and then I came home and had to choose a topic for my thesis, and I really just felt like an urge to talk about this because people just seemingly haven't talked about it. And that's also one of the things you need to keep in mind when writing a thesis is you need to have something new, bring something new to the table. And this certainly was new for a lot of people. So to the thesis itself, these were my main research questions. So what ideas Icelanders had about Indigenous people before emigrating, and then how the West goers, as we like to call them, how they went on to establish a colony that was exclusive to Icelanders, and then finally what their interactions were like with their neighboring Indigenous people. So I've set these slides up just sort of chapter by chapter. So the first chapter of the thesis tries to answer what ideas Icelanders had about Indigenous people. Now, the main sources that I looked at were newspapers and magazine articles from around 1830 up to 1875, which is when the sort of big emigration started. I also looked at manuscripts. One of them was by Jón Bjarnason that he wrote in 1850, where he divided humankind into categories. And then finally, I looked at what people who had already immigrated were writing. Now, these were the main conclusions that I could draw from this. Othering is a key term. So Icelanders often wrote about Indigenous people as if they had nothing in common with them and that they were superior to them. There's also a large emphasis on skin color, many shades of red. And then there's also this strong emphasis on morality, that they were uncivilized, drunken, dirty savages. But there are also a lot of contradictions in these texts. In some places, they are peaceful, elsewhere, they are aggressive, hardworking, yet lazy, smart, yet stupid, and etc. So from this, I think it's pretty clear that the Icelanders had negative ideas of Indigenous people, and it becomes even more obvious when they started writing home. I want to show you one example of a manuscript. So this is written between 1845 and 1852 by Jón Bjarnason. He was a farmer, but he was very interested in various sciences, and he was completely self-taught. So in this manuscript, he categorizes humans by race and has a lot of very interesting drawings. This is one of them. So on the top is a drawing of a naked man, and then a European man, and then just people. And then on the bottom is a drawing of Inuits. So in his manuscript, this is a chapter on the people of North America, and he says, "Many savages walk completely naked in North America, and they are more hardy. They rub their faces with red earth or clay and bear fat, and paint images of snakes and various crawling creatures on their faces in order to appear more fierce and frightening." And now this is Sigtryggur Jónasson. He is generally called the father of New Iceland. He was the first Icelander to settle in Canada, moving there in 1872 when he was only about 20 years old. Now, he wrote this article in a paper called Norðanfari, partly to encourage more people to emigrate west. This article, he goes over the advantages and disadvantages of moving to Canada. And by the end of the article, he says, "There is still one thing that I know many people greatly fear in America, and that is the terrible Indians. To reassure those who are afraid, I can say that they are as peaceful as lambs, as long as one simply does not give them whiskey or other alcoholic drinks. That, moreover, is punishable here in Canada." Now, Sigtryggur also helped writing this report, translates to New Iceland in Canada. It's basically like an advertisement or a promotional pamphlet for immigration. It explained which route to take, what to keep in mind, and what to be aware of. And he lists bears, wolves, and Indians, which is where I got my title from. And he says, "When we spoke about the fishing, we mentioned the Indians who live by Lake Winnipeg. It may be noted here that these people live in tents and huts near Sandy Bar. No one needs to be afraid of them because they are both Christian and civilized, and moreover, they belong to the group of Indians who are the most peaceful. Nowhere further west is there a place where there is less reason to fear Indians than in our colony. When the Icelanders begin to build their settlement, these Indians will be moved to another place." Maybe not surprisingly, but he doesn't say where they'll be moved. They will just be moved. Now, this last sentence relates somewhat to the second chapter of my thesis. There I tried to explain how Icelanders were able to build this settlement, and I tried to analyze their position versus the position of Indigenous peoples. So this is a treaty map. For those of you that don't know, these were land treaties that the Canadian government made with First Nations in order to acquire their land. Now, these treaties are controversial, mainly because Indigenous people had a different understanding than Europeans of what it meant to give up land, but I won't get into that here. But in just a few years, the Canadian government had acquired all of this land, and they needed people to move there. So one way that they did that was through the Homestead Act, where adult men could apply for 240 acres of land for free, on the condition that they lived on it and farmed it for 3 years. And the government also began reserving land and assigning it to specific groups. Some areas were reserves for Indigenous people, and other areas for the railway, and some areas were designed or designated for specific nationalities. Then they launched a campaign to attract certain groups to the country, and it's perhaps not surprising that the people that they wanted most were from the Nordic countries and Western Europe. I think it's worth noting that the Norway House Cree made claims to what would later become New Iceland, but Canadian officials sided with the new European immigrants. Now, just briefly about the position of Indigenous people at the same
Just to
time.
ask a quick question, can you explain to people what the Norway House was? So some people might not know.
I believe it is a nation. Hold on, I think it's actually on this map. Number 17,
Yeah.
if you guys can
So
see that.
it was
A
a trading
community,
post
yes.
for trading, but
Hmm.
a Cree band
Hmm.
lived there too. But yeah. Anyway, go
Yes.
ahead. Thanks.
Yes. Great point. Thank you, Jason. Also, feel free to stop me if I'm speaking too fast or anything. Anyway, where was I? Yes, about the position of Indigenous people at the same time. So yeah, the Canadian government had spent most of the second half of the 19th century trying to gain control over Indigenous communities. All of these laws on the screen were aimed at assimilating Indigenous people into the new European Canadian society. Now they defined what made someone Indigenous and created a special legal status for them. Now the government constantly tried to persuade Indigenous people to give up this status, and in return they would receive things like free land, citizenship, and the right to vote. But the last law, the Indian Act, was harsher than the early ones. The government began banning most aspects of their culture, such as religious ceremonies and festivals, even certain dances and clothing, and pushed them onto reserves. And from about 1885 up until 1940, they even needed written permission to leave the reserves. So Icelanders had far greater rights and freedom of movement than the people who had lived there their entire lives. On this map, the red dots are reserves, and that little blue dot is Gimli. Just how you can see how close everything was. So while writing this, I had to look at so many different maps just to figure out where everything was and how close it actually was. Now, just briefly about the nations who actually lived there around Lake Winnipeg. So these are Cree, Ojibwe, and Saulteaux peoples. I found it pretty difficult to find good written sources about these nations because in a lot of their communities, they value oral history much more over the written one. And I also had a very hard time finding photographs of them. So for a long time, I tried to figure out what these people actually looked like. And then I met this man. This is Michael Hart from the Fisher River Cree Nation. So last year, I did a radio interview about this thesis. Michael happened to be in Iceland and he contacted me and wanted to meet me. So for those of you who are curious about what Indigenous people look like, here's one example. He probably doesn't look that much different than his ancestors 100 years ago, yet they were described as red savages. Um,
So I saw you on that interview on TV, and so Michael contacted you. He was in Iceland, said, "Hey, can we meet?"
yeah,
That's great. Okay.
that was pretty, yeah, that was
Yeah.
very shocking. So on to the third and final chapter, and the one that I found most exciting to write, the actual interactions between Icelanders and Indigenous people. Now, this is a very large group, and I mean, we're talking like 15,000 people plus, and also a very long time period, about 40 years. So for this project, I narrowed it down and focused mostly on the first years in New Iceland. And the story that I want to tell you today is the story of John Ramsay. Now, he was from the Saulteaux Nation and is said to have been a great friend of the Icelanders. He helped them a lot when they first arrived and is even said to have spoken some Icelandic. He was very popular among the Icelandic immigrants and became somewhat of a legend in the Icelandic West. But his story has perhaps been less examined from his own perspective. He actually ended up in major land disputes with them. In 1876, three families who had spent the first winter in Gimli decided to move to the Icelandic River, which was then called the White Mud River, and built a house there near a log cabin that was owned by Hudson's Bay. And they named it Möðruvöllur. Now, Ramsay lived nearby and had a potato garden there. So when the Icelanders started building and Ramsay saw them, he tried to talk to them, tried to stop them, but due to language barriers, nothing happened. And then one day, as the Icelanders came rowing up the river, Ramsay stood on the riverbank and kicked their boat away. Now, the Icelanders tried to land again, but Ramsay pushed them away again. And that ended up with Ólafur Ólafsson, an Icelandic man, to pull up an axe and swing it at Ramsay. So Ramsay disappeared and they continued building. While they were building, the Icelanders' sons were playing outside when they saw a group of indigenous men firing guns into the air. They ran home to tell the others, and before they knew it, a group of indigenous people had entered the log cabin armed with guns. So they sat in a semicircle on one side of the cabin, and the Icelanders sat opposite of them. So this was probably a pretty scary moment for them, but after some time, Ramsay arrived with an interpreter. Now, the interpreter told the Icelanders that the indigenous people believed that their settlement was illegal. Now, the Icelanders were unsure about this, so they decided to go back to Gimli to ask Sigtryggur Jónsson, the father of New Iceland. So they went there and met Sigtryggur, who was traveling with an immigrant group, but with them also was an Indian agent. And he was able to tell them that they had every right to the land as they were Icelanders, and they could just go back and tell Ramsay that. So they went back and they told Ramsay, and he was forced to accept it. But he did end up making an agreement with Ólafur, the man that swung the axe, that he could continue to cultivate his potato garden and that he could keep his tent in the garden. But that agreement didn't last for long. So in the fall of 1876, a smallpox epidemic broke out in the colony, most likely brought by an Icelander. It was a very severe epidemic. Out of roughly 1,200 Icelanders that had moved there, about 100 of them died, but up to twice as many indigenous people passed away during that epidemic. Now, Ramsay helped the Icelanders a great deal during the epidemic and transported doctors between farms, but he repeatedly complained about the behavior of the Icelanders. He said that they refused to help the indigenous people, and they had even started demanding payment for digging their graves. Now, when the epidemic ended and the area was to be disinfected, the authorities decided the best solution was to burn down all indigenous settlements. They burned down houses and belongings and the bodies of indigenous people, while New Iceland remained untouched. Now, not only had Ramsay lost much of his community, he also lost his wife and 4 children, and then his land. The family who lived at Möruvöllur moved to North Dakota in 1879, and Ramsay saw this as an opportunity to finally obtain the land. He repeatedly contacted the authorities about it, but in the end, it was Jón Bergvinsson, who was just some random Icelander, who got the land. This is perhaps one of the greatest or clearest examples of the unequal legal status of these groups, where a relatively recent immigrant had the right to the land, but not the man who had lived there his whole life and farmed it. So in my thesis, I discussed several other examples of this, including the story of Helgi Einarsson, who married an indigenous woman named Sara Stakk. His biography is titled A Manitoba Fisherman. It's available both in English and Icelandic. And if you want the other examples, you'll just have to read my thesis, but you have to learn Icelandic for that. But yeah, so in conclusion, it seems quite clear that Icelanders generally had negative ideas about indigenous people when immigration began, and they carried those prejudices with them. And although there are examples of positive interactions between the groups, the arrival of Icelandic settlers generally had negative effects on indigenous people, for example, through land dispossession and the smallpox epidemic. And then also, I think it's worth noting that the Icelanders arrive at a very turbulent time where there is an ongoing conflict between indigenous peoples and the authorities, and they somehow have to adapt to that situation. And then just finally, this is completely imperfect research. It is only a bachelor's thesis where you only have about 50 pages to work with and get your point across. There are so many more examples of those interactions that I would have loved to look at. I was in Iceland, so I didn't have access to the Canadian archives, but I worked with what I had. But yeah, better research will have to come at a better time. But yeah, there does seem to be a lot of interest in this, which I found very surprising. It seems to be coming from all sides, both Icelandic people and the descendants of Icelandic immigrants, but as well as Indigenous people. Like Michael said, like he wanted to tell or wanted to hear his own history. And I think it is time to start looking at this from different perspectives, like through post-colonialism. And yeah, just to end this, I have probably my second favorite picture that I took while I was in Canada. This is a man named Farley. This is in Saskatchewan. He's wearing this great shirt. You know, when you're having fun when the brandewin is done, party like an Icelander, which is, I think, a little ironic when you're looking at sources that talk about drunken Indians, when I don't think the Icelanders were any better. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. That was such a complete presentation of kind of the history, and I have so many questions. I know many people have
Mhm.
questions. I thought I just started off. So here in the United States, most people don't know the word Obijwe. They're called Chippewa, the
Mm.
tribe. Um, but in Canada, that's what they're called. So just for anyone who's from the United States. But I wanted to bring up this topic of the asymmetry of the two groups. So uh, the Chippewa had their first contact with Europeans was in 1640, and over 200 years before the 235 years before the Icelanders came, they had developed sort of a mythology. They're one of their chiefs that had a vision that they had to move west towards Manitoba. And Minnesota, and they displaced the Lakota, who then we all know as a Plains, South Dakota, North Dakota tribe, um, and Alberta, and they had gained superior weapons. They knew European culture, but then the Icelanders came. They have tons of contact through the fur trade through other with Europeans for 200 years, and so they knew a lot more about Europeans than Icelanders knew about Native Americans or Native peoples.
Definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And so I just think it's important to recognize that it wasn't like they were coming that they both didn't really understand each other. It was more like the Icelanders didn't really understand their culture,
Hmm.
probably.
Yeah, I think that is a big part of it. Yeah.
Before I get to the questions, the other thing I wanted to bring up was uh, Troy Vigvason, who you mentioned
Hmm.
in your little write up.
Oh yeah.
I think he's such an amazing person who, this whole idea of collective memory. What do we remember as a group? What do we imagine? Collective future imagining of who we are, what we are, and what do we forget, right? And
Hmm.
so maybe you can tell us a little about him and the dream he had and what happened.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for those, you guys might be familiar with this. It's a pretty famous story. So there was a man named Triste Vigfússon who moved to Canada, I believe, in 1899, somewhere around that time. And he really loved hearing stories, all types of stories. And the story of John Ramsey was very popular. It's this idea of like, oh, there's this really cool indigenous man who like helps us. And like he became very like enticed with this idea of Ramsey being such a helpful figure, and he heard about his troubles during the smallpox epidemic. So in 1908, he had a dream where Ramsey came out of the forest into Thirste's house and asked him. So Thirste was a carpenter. So he asked Thirste to build a fence around his wife's grave, um, and she had been dead for I think about 30 years at that point, right? And Thirste wakes up from the dream and is like, he starts talking about it to people like, oh, should I do this? Should I not do this? And a lot of differing opinions. And Triste, like many of the immigrants, he was not a rich man. He was pretty poor, but he always had that dream in his head. So in like a few years passed until he actually went and built that grave. And it's a very like iconic story of like, oh, this random man who never met Ramsay, by the way,
Right.
started to
There's
just
parallels with, when you think about mythology, there's parallels with
mhm,
like the New Testament. And what is the strongest influence on it's Paul, who never met Jesus. All the other apostles
mhm,
wrote these stories that they had met him, they knew him. And it was sort of a similar thing. Like he had this vision, he had this dream about John Ramsey. John Ramsey told them to build this grave. Then there's a lot of data on well, they've talked to his daughter, Tristy's daughter,
mhm,
and try to clarify things. And because the myth about his dream became different than what actually may have happened. So the
mhm.
myth is that he had a second dream
Yeah,
which encouraged
there's a
him to
lot of
come back. And but his
yes,
daughter
there's
said
a
no,
lot
that
of
wasn't the case. He just was very poor, and it took him many years to collect the wood to
mhm.
make a good fence. Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of different versions of the dream. In some versions, like he was very unlucky until he finally
Until that's
finished
right.
it.
It
And
became
then,
very mythologized that he
yeah,
he he got all these fish and he became like this
yeah,
prosperous
exactly.
person, which is super interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah. Um, I'm just looking here at the questions. Have you ever thought about expanding this information into a museum exhibit of some
Ooh,
kind? Maybe at Hofsós or I don't know where. Have you
yeah.
or the East Iceland Immigration Center in Vopnafjörður? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I haven't thought about it, but that's definitely an interesting idea. A lot of people have like challenged me to do something more with this. I just haven't had the time. Yeah, I mean that's very interesting. I think there's still a lot more research to be done, so maybe I finally have an excuse to go back to Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll keep that in mind.
Or you could do an exhibit in Canada.
I could do that as well.
um, okay, Gail writes, it's my understanding that the indigenous peoples were key in the survival of Icelanders in the first winter when they landed at Gimli. And they also taught Icelanders how to fish in the winter using the jigger.
hmm
Did you know anything about that?
I couldn't find any like very specific sources that actually described it. It was
Hmm.
mostly just people that had written like, "Oh, they helped us," and that was it.
Right, right,
It's like, I'm not sure if it was just like minimal contact or if it was, yeah, it's
right.
very hard to tell. And again, like it is a big group of people, so maybe one person, maybe never met someone who was indigenous, and another one could have, had a really good relationship with someone.
Yeah. My understanding is, and maybe you came across the name Joseph Monkman. I don't
hmm
know if you did, but that he was another native person who was very helpful to the Icelanders. He hasn't been mythologized like Ramsay as
hmm
the biggest helper, but in fact, he was the one who took some Icelanders out on Lake Winnipeg and showed them how to fish and where to fish.
hmm
And he also stood up for Ramsay in his claim for the land. So,
hmm
like you mentioned to me in email that this they had a nuance. The relationship between the Icelanders and the native people was nuanced, which I think is
hmm
very true about all of American and Canadian history. That there were these friendships and helping, but there was also disputes and siding, with the other side on certain things. So, um, anyway, that I thought that was interesting.
hmm
Um, Jodine, who hi
Oh, hey,
Jodine,
Jodine.
she writes that I'm curious about narratives about birthing in the colony and in adjacent indigenous communities, and whether there were indigenous birth workers who supported the
Oh.
Icelandic women and vice versa. Have you encountered anything about this in your studies?
Ooh, that is a great question. No, this is not something that I've come across. I was because my research focused on the sort of the first years in New Iceland, and one of those years is the smallpox epidemic.
Mhm.
So that's yeah, the 102 people who died, most of them were children and teenagers. So I think yeah, there is a lot to that would be interesting to research when it comes to health and practices of medicine, I think you could assume that in some cases, Indigenous people would have helped in one way or another, just like they helped perhaps with fishing and practical things like that. But yeah, no, I this is something that I would love to look into, definitely.
So there's another question, and just to give some context, so there was the Kinmount group who went up the Red River in flatboats
Hmm.
and encountered Native peoples in Manitoba. But there was also a group that went to Wisconsin.
Hmm.
Um, Jon Olafsson led that, was one of the leaders of that group. And there were some adventurers from Arabaki who, four people who went to Wisconsin early, and then Jon Olafsson um, uh, wanted to make that Icelanders felt that the summers in the Midwest were very hot,
Hmm.
and they wanted to ask the U.S. government to give them land in Alaska. There was an Alaska expedition.
Hmm.
Um, One of my great grandfathers was a signer of that. Uh, and anyway, that never happened. It was, but the question has to do, and I think this is Gail Gislason. Did you research any interactions on that expedition between Native peoples in Alaska uh, and Icelanders?
I did not.
Yeah,
No.
yeah. And
Unfortunately,
I don't
this is
think much
something.
is written about that. I just have not.
No, I think I just
Mhm.
brushed over yeah, Jon's trip or his ideas of Alaska. But yeah, not those interactions specifically, but something that definitely could be looked into.
So yeah, I went into Northern Faury and looked at the articles. There were some articles. Paul Thorlekson wrote some stuff back about what it was like in Wisconsin, etc. But there was nothing about Native Americans other than the Sigtryggur Jónsson that you mentioned in that paper.
Hmm.
Um, but one thing I wanted to ask you about was the media. So 19th century Iceland, people are
Hmm.
copying books by hand and trading them. That's how there was the printing press was mostly used for religious stuff. There were newspapers, and from my reading of the newspapers, there was like a sort of pre-syndication idea. So articles would or news would come from other Icelanders were very interested in what was happening in the world.
Hmm.
You know, what's going on in Russia, what's going on in France, what's going on in North America. Even before they emigrated, right? They wanted to
Hmm.
know what was going on in the world. And there were these articles that would kind of describe for them in Icelandic, this is what, and they were taken from other sources.
Hmm.
Now, in North America, between 1840 and 1860, before the majority of the Icelanders, although the Mormons had come in the 1850s, there were these extreme articles about how dangerous the savages were. They would would take events, violent events, and blow them up. Um, and I'm wondering if you found anything like that. Did you see any
Hmm.
articles that were relaying information in like the 1840s or 50s about that in Icelandic newspapers? Like there was a scalping, or there was this,
Hmm.
attack on Norwegian
Oh
settlers,
yeah,
and
that
yeah,
is
yeah.
yes. So there was a paper or magazine called Skirtnir. It was published once a year, and it was
Mhm.
like news of the world. So there's a
Mhm.
chapter. So it's yeah, what's going on in Russia? What happened this year in Mexico? What happened in the
Mhm.
States? And so pretty early on in 1832, that's the first mention of Native Americans. And they describe like, oh, there's like they give like names to them, like what tribes or nations they were part
Mhm.
of, how many of them, and how many of them had died due to smallpox and other diseases, right? And they sort of feel for them. But then as time goes on, especially around 1850, 1860, they begin to describe them as savages and as
Mm,
like so I wonder, they never cite where their sources come from. I'm assuming it's mostly Denmark, maybe also England.
hmm.
So they sort of changed their perspectives. Like at first they call them like red people, and then later on they are, yeah, savages who are attacking people. They're attacking railroad workers. They're scalping people. Yeah, so it's a very twisted term.
Right. The other source I was wondering about was excerpts from novels. So in the United States and probably Canada also, there were very popular novels. Um, The Last of the Mohicans in the mid early 1800s, The Prairie. There was the Diary of Molly Dorsey Sanford, talked about being on the frontier and fear of Native Americans, and I'm wondering were those stories passed on through. I know a lot of literature got sort of translated to Icelandic and shared, and I didn't
Mhm.
know if you ran across anything like that.
No, I tried my best to look into it,
Mhm.
but I couldn't find any books about it. I mean, we're a very bookish nation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So I was like, yeah, so like there must be some fiction or some novel about this, but I couldn't find it. But I think it's very possible that it is somewhere just locked away in someone's attic.
yeah. Um, One thing I wanted to bring up was this idea that how did the Icelanders there's different Icelanders, right? So there's Icelanders who were living in Iceland who were afraid to come to North America, and there's accounts of people saying things like you're going to get eaten alive by native peoples.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's Icelanders who came and changed their got firsthand contact. But I'm wondering how did they have any sympathy for the natives at all in the writings that you came across? Because um, there is evidence that Icelanders saw themselves as immigrants as lesser people. They were worried, for instance, in the book Modern Sagas, which it talks about some of the early pioneers. They thought that if they went south, they might be enslaved like African Americans because they were different. They faced when they came to the Kinmount group when they arrived in Kinmount. We're told that by the Canadians that they had expected to see Inuit-looking people who are about 4 feet tall and black hair. Um, and so I'm just wondering. And then they did face the Western Icelanders faced a lot of discrimination, both in sports and in just in the communities. Their culture kind of got narrowed down to Vinartarta and other things. But I'm wondering, did you encounter any sympathy towards towards them in the
Mm,
writings?
not in the writings that I looked at. I'm sure there's some, but yeah, I mean, like I said before, like they show up in Canada during these very sort of turbulent times where like the Indian Act is being put in place, but they are also being discriminated against, so they just sort of have to choose a way to adapt. Um, but no, yeah, I didn't find a lot of sympathy for them, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, no, I mean, I think maybe there wasn't in the writings, And the other thing is the writings are kind of a stage, and so
Hmm.
I was thinking that there seemed to be a lot of sympathy for in the community, in the collective consciousness for John Ramsey, because
Hmm.
Troisty would not have come up with that dream if he hadn't been hearing those stories. He arrived 23 years after the first settlers.
Hmm. Exactly.
Um, yeah. And as my understanding also is that he was the architect of the Ingemiri in the Icelandic river settlements.
Hmm.
So he has despite being a poor carpenter, he's had a lot of influence on the culture.
Yeah, definitely.
Let me just check if there's any other questions. Um, Jodine asks if So there was efforts to keep Icelanders on the in the farm system, right?
Hmm.
And not to leave. And they were told that there was an anti-emigration movement in Iceland. And there was
Yes.
a lot of prejudice against people in the
Hmm.
north and the east who were leaving,
Hmm.
because the farm owners and the Danes, etc., were going to lose out because they didn't have farm workers, right?
Hmm.
And so Jodine is asking if the anti-immigration movement intentionally painted North America as a dangerous place.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, yeah, people were very much against immigration. I mean, this is also during the height of the Icelandic independence movement. So a lot of people would look at the those who immigrated as traitors. And there was, yeah, one newspaper article that I found, which was a response to that advertisement pamphlet that Sigtryggur wrote about New Iceland, where someone was like, you guys are all traitors, and what are you like? These Indians will kill you anyway. Like that was sort of the gist of it. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but um, yeah, I think that definitely, they needed to keep people there in Iceland. So yeah, but like fear mongering works in
Mm-hmm.
some ways.
Yeah. Um, there's a lot of comments in here. Someone comments, White Sailor Reserve is a good book describing how Icelanders became included in European privilege
Hmm.
for allotments in Canada. And I know you've read
Yes.
that book. You told me you cited Ryan's book.
Yes.
So that's good to know for people.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Someone comments that fear of being enslaved when coming to North America may have been tied to Icelanders being enslaved in 1627 with the Turkish
Yes,
boats
the
that
trade.
came.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that definitely a lot of people feared foreigners or just something foreign because it's so easy because it's such an isolated country. It's so easy to feed lies and to scare them a little bit. But I mean, most people still ended up moving. I mean, 15,000 people is such a large group of
For Iceland,
people.
it's a huge number, right?
Yeah, it's like I think like
It was like a
20%.
Yeah, it was like a third of the country or something, or quarter of the
Yeah,
country.
yeah, yeah. So many people. So I wonder like if no one was scared, if there wasn't this like fear of moving, how many people would have actually ended up moving?
Right. One thing I read was that the uh, Sigtrygger would counter these concerns about the native people by saying, look, the Norwegians have been here for 30 years in North
Hmm.
America, in the US and Canada, and they're doing great. And they've been prosperous. So, the proof is in the pudding. We're
Hmm.
going to go there or we're here and we're going to make a great society. Um, so what do you think? And this has been really helpful from sort of a critical theory standpoint, understanding, taking apart what happened and understanding and critiquing. But where does that leave us? Like, where should we go from here? And what did uh, Troy Stee's dream? It has painted a positive picture of the relationship, and it has it was an attempt to harmonize relations, I think. It also reflects sort of a collective consciousness at the time. But what are your thoughts on where do we go from here?
That's a really good
Maybe
question.
you don't
And
have an
I
answer.
think I I
You
totally
didn't expect me to ask such a philosophical question.
no, but it's a great question. Well, I think I think the one thing that the way that I'm moving forward as an Icelander who's born in Iceland is just sort of educating people. Because, like, when
Mm-hmm.
I've been telling people these stories, they're like, oh, I didn't know that there were Indigenous people there. Like, they just, like, there's so many people, especially younger people, who don't know the story of the Icelandic immigrants.
Right.
Older people generally know a lot more. But yeah, to just educate those people about what really happened and what people were there when they immigrated. But as for the communities of the descendants of Icelandic immigrants, I'm not sure where you guys go on from there.
You're
I
going
think
to let us
that's
figure it
more,
out, right?
yeah, I think so.
I actually think that I think Troisty did a positive thing with what he did, and
Hmm.
I think it's good to I think it's good to harmonize. I don't think we ought to forget the bad things.
Hmm.
I think we ought to, but I think we can talk about them. I think by elevating John Ramsey, that was a way to move in a positive direction.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, yeah, and more can be done for sure.
Hmm.
Um, okay, we have not one more. Congrats. This is from Jody, who you know.
Oh, hi,
Congrats,
Jody.
Hitler. Well done. She wants to know, what are you doing at Ruve?
Yes, so I'm an assistant producer for the news part or like yeah, the news. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of different things. I'm how do I again, English is not my first language. Yeah, I make sure that the news go out at the right time for the radio. Then I file a lot of things. It's very history driven. To
So
yeah,
are you assigned to like history stories, or are you
no, just everything.
everything? Okay.
Everything. So it's a lot of filing like clips and finding clips. I've now have access to like the Louvre Museum, which
Hmm.
is great for a historian to like nerd out at. So often have to find archive material.
Oh, I bet that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, and then it's just yeah, putting like microphones on people for the evening news and yeah, it's a lot of technical stuff as well that I probably yeah won't be able to explain fully. But it's a great I'm having a great time there.
That's great. That's wonderful. Let me see if I had any other questions here. I may have gone through all of these. Uh, yeah, I don't have any more questions, and there aren't any more, but I just wanted to give you a chance. Was there anything we didn't cover or that we missed? This was
Mm.
such a wonderful presentation. You did such a great job.
Thank you so much. Um, Yeah, no, I don't think I have anything else to add. Hopefully I will get more research done in a few years' time. We'll probably have an excuse to go back to Canada, maybe even the US, who knows? Yeah, looking forward to maybe introducing that at some point.
Well, I'm sure Suna would like to invite you to Mountain, North Dakota at some point to talk at the Deuce and August Honors, and also to maybe at Icelandingadagurinn, you could give a talk too. That would
Hmm.
be fantastic. We'll save a cowboy hat for you, and or you can bring it on the plane. It's up to you.
Great, great.
All
Looking
right. Well,
forward to
thank
it.
you so much. This was one of the best we've done recently, and I think everyone. I noticed there was just such a buzz about what you did in the Icelandic media, and I think
Hmm.
I'm glad that everyone's been so interested. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.